Hi everyone and welcome to chapter 10 where we are going to cover discipline and disciplinary behaviors. So let's start off by defining discipline. What is discipline? And this is, training expected to produce a desired behavior. This is also a way we control behavior by using sanctions and punishments. Morale and discipline are closely intertwined. If morale is high and the agency is doing well, you tend to have fewer disciplinary problems. And vice versa. If morale is low, we tend to see those problems increase. So once again, the importance of morale rears its head. Discipline should always be corrective and constructive. So we don't mean it. There should never be meting out punishment just for the sake of punishment. It should be about remediation. It should be about learning what you did wrong, how not to do it again in the future. And how do we do this? Well, that's by having very clear rules and regulations established in the agency. And those rules need to be publicly dispersed. If officers literally don't know what the rules are, how can they follow them? Right? They might inadvertently be breaking them. So the rules, every agency is different, every organization is different, but they all have some, general commonalities, and they're going to be as follows. So first of all, professional conduct is expected. Officers can't be unruly, they can't be misbehaving, they can't be acting inappropriate or unprofessional, especially in front of arrestees and the general public. The officers are required to preserve the law and public safety. Officers cannot make false reports, whether it's verbally or written. Body cameras go a long way in making sure that this doesn't happen. There are general orders that are broad statements of policy. These are going to be written versions of rules, policy, regulation, and procedures, along with instructions on how those procedures should be implemented. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the development of policy and the dissemination of practical application of that policy. And when that happens, we call this decoupling, right? So that there's this big discrepancy that someone somewhere in an office who isn't on the front lines wrote that policy and they've been removed from the front lines for a while. It sounds good in theory, but when it actually gets applied out in the street, it fails to work. That would be decoupling, okay? And like I said, that's because, often these are, the people writing policy are removed from the street for some period of time. So it's important that we vet all policies. And the vetting process is going to be where the line staff and the people who are on the front line out on the street dealing with the community look at those policies and they say, working really well, or you know what, this isn't getting the job done. And then they provide feedback to the organization to make sure that those policies have practical application. So ultimately, disruptive behavior in policing can manifest for many different reasons. One is job dissatisfaction. Remember that this is a very high stress job with lots of negative feedback coming at officers from all angles. So job dissatisfaction can sneak in and we can see, officers acting out as a result. Personal problems. Officers are people just like everybody else. They have marital issues. They have kids who may have, behavioral issues or health issues or concerns. They have financial issues just like everybody else, and that can bleed into the workplace. Health problems are another one. And dissatisfaction with leadership and or policy development. You're going to see some pushback from officers if they're unhappy with the administration and if they're unhappy with policy, and it's going to manifest itself in a disruptive way. When we say problem behavior in law enforcement, it tends to be our young officers. It tends to happen early in their career, and it tends to be an issue of they just aren't seasoned yet. They haven't been through all of the processes and they haven't quite learned what the more seasoned officers have learned. Remember, we talked about in previous chapters how very expensive it is to train an officer. So we don't just want to discipline them, cut them off and be done, because that's a very expensive process, especially if you start doing it with multiple officers. So you want to take that investment that you've had in that officer and you want to continue with it instead of wasting it and cutting it off. So you want to remediate, right? You don't want to just up and fire people. You want to remediate. You want to educate. You want to refine. So how do we deal with problem behaviors? So what are some problem behaviors? So abusing sick leave is one, right? People who are unhappy on the job will do that. Sick leave is literally there if you're ill. It's not vacation time. And it weakens the organization's ability to do its job if people are abusing sick leave. Substance abuse is very common in law enforcement, and that includes illegal substances, illegal drug use, as well as alcoholism. It's a method of self-medication. It's a method of stress management because this is a highly stressful job. But certainly this is incredibly problematic. So if somebody has a substance abuse problem, you're putting, your fellow officers at threat because, you're not functioning in a sober, sharp capacity. This tends to weaken morale, and often officers will fight, the admitting that they have an alcohol problem or that they have a drug problem because they're afraid of losing their job. They're afraid of the stigma that comes with that. However, the stigma needs to be removed because the whole the approach that needs to happen here is not, okay, you're fired. It's okay, you have an alcohol problem, you have a substance abuse problem. We need to get you into treatment. We need to, again, educate you, mediate on how you can better manage the stress of your job, right? So that that's no longer an issue that interrupts the workplace. Corruption is a big one. Corruption is a disruptive behavior, obviously. Officers have a lot of autonomous performance on the job and a lot of unchecked discretionary decision making. There's nobody looking over their shoulder the bulk of the time. So we get back to those arguments of integrity and ethics because you're going to be offered bribes and you're going to be in the presence of drug money that is, there's no record of it anywhere and you could just take it, right? And nobody would be the wiser, right? So, and the big problem here, I mean, aside from just it's completely undermining the job, but when one person gets accused of corruption and it's proven that they engaged in corruption, it immediately casts a shadow on everybody in that organization, whether the other people engage in corruption or not. So that has really far-reaching consequences. Insubordination is the failure to comply with direct orders from supervisors, right? So that's obviously going to be disruptive. Sexual harassment in the workplace, right? And this can happen in a myriad of directions. Officers sexually harassing community members, or officers sexually harassing one another in the workplace, whether it's from colleague to colleague or supervisor to subordinate. This clearly creates a hostile work environment where people are not going to be happy on all sides. And it also results in a lot of very costly lawsuits. So this is something that needs to be controlled in the environment immediately before it spirals out of control. And sanctions, appropriate sanctions, need to be levied, and the policies and the procedures need to be clearly understood by all. Use of excessive force. This is, again, another one that can result in large lawsuits, big payouts, and very negative feedback from the community. And it erodes trust between the community and the police. Remember that use of force is, it's a continuum, right? That we start over here with the least amount of force, and then we end all the way over here with the most force, which is deadly force. Officers should always, always, always start at the lower end and escalate. You don't just jump to the end, right? So you want to start out with verbal commands, right? Believe it or not, raising your voice and levying a verbal command will bring a lot of people to heel very quickly, right? And that is a measure of use of force. It's the least intrusive measure. And it's certainly how we want to resolve an issue. If we can resolve an issue verbally, we should. There's physical restraint, right? There's less than lethal force. So there's going to be pepper spray. There's going to be the baton. There's going to be the taser, etc. But even then, it has to be used responsibly. You can't just willy-nilly tase somebody because they're really getting on your nerves, even though we'd all like to do that from time to time. You have legal responsibilities and limitations, and misuse of that force will result in lawsuits and disciplinary behaviors all the way up to termination. Using excessive force. So this is going to be the illegal use of force where you use an unnecessary amount of force to obtain compliance. If somebody's complying, it's time to stop. It's time to back off. You can't just continue to use the baton or continue to tase them if you've got compliance. Once there is compliance, the use of force needs to stop. And deadly force. So this is use of force that results in an officer-involved death, right? Where they use their firearm and they discharge a round or multiple rounds and someone dies as a result. That is obviously a last resort. And it is certainly something that has been at the forefront of our media coverage in the past several years, and it's under a lot of scrutiny right now in law enforcement. I want you to know what non-actor liability is, and we saw this in the Derek Chauvin case. So let me define it, and then I'll give you the example of it. If you're an officer and you stand by and watch and do not interrupt another officer who's engaging in excessive use of force, you are also legally liable. not only can you be sued, but you can be arrested and prosecuted. So this is, or at the, a much smaller level, just disciplined within your organization. This is something to keep in mind, right? Unfortunately for, I think, one or two officers involved in the Chauvin case, it was literally, they were rookies. They were right out of the academy. They were brand new. And you have Derek Chauvin, who is a seasoned officer who is engaging in excessive use of force that resulted in the death of a civilian. And all of those officers lost their jobs and were prosecuted for that, not just Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin's the only one who physically partook, but the other officers stood by and allowed it to happen. So that is an example of non-actor liability, and you need to remember that you have a responsibility to make sure that the law is being applied safely and legally. Okay. So how do different agencies manage excessive force and keeping it, out of their organization? Through good written policy and good communication with your line staff and training, right? As much training as possible. Have that problem-based scenario training so that yes, it's not real. It's a scenario, but you don't go in cold. That when you go into a circumstance, you've already practiced things very similar to this, and you know what you're going to do, you know what you should do, you know what you shouldn't do, right? So training. Okay. So what about off-duty misconduct? Officers can be disciplined for misconduct that occurs when they're out of uniform. So remember that even though you are not on the job and you're not wearing your uniform, you are still an officer and you are still culpable for your behavior off duty. So once again, discipline should focus on corrective behavior, and it should be applied swiftly after the incident. There should not be a big delay. It should not be like a year-long delay. The greater the delay, and this is true of all punishment, whether it's for police or for your dog that you're training or for a child that you're rearing, the greater the delay between the incident and the punishment, the less learning and behavioral modification that will happen. So you don't want to delay. Law enforcement often uses something that we call progressive discipline, where the discipline starts out, again, on a continuum, and it's at a lower level, and it increases if you continue to be disruptive. So this is the first time we've ever had to have an issue. We're going to give you an oral warning. We're going to give you a light disciplinary procedure. Well, 3 months later, you're back in my office. Okay, well, the oral warning and obviously didn't work. I need to escalate, right? So now you're going to get a written warning, and it's going to go in your file, I see you again 3 months later. Now you're going to get suspended, so that the discipline increases if the behavior continues. Just jumping back to our talk about the unions and collective bargaining, it's very challenging and difficult to terminate a police officer because of collective bargaining and the negotiation that goes on between the union and the administration. So certainly if an officer gets terminated, it's usually in the most egregious of circumstances. But at the same time, it's a very fine line to walk, because an agency can't avoid firing an officer because they don't want to battle the union, right? If an officer has done something that is a termination worthy offense and you keep him or her on, that's called negligent retention. And you are liable for that person's behavior. So if somebody should have been fired and you didn't fire them because I don't want to battle the union, and then they go engage in excessive force and they kill a member of the community, well, now not only is that, it's not just that officer that's going to be sued, it's going to be the entire organization, and you're accountable because you should have fired him, but you didn't, or her. When discipline is meted out, officers have the right to appeal the outcome. And that appeal is usually request for that disciplinary decision to be reviewed by someone higher in command, in the command structure, to say, yes, this is a legitimate application of discipline, or no, this is over the top.